hello everyone. Alex here. So we're back with another exhibition game number 8. So today my special guest is from Taiwan. So Mr. Chang Chun-Yi from Taiwan. So he's actually a former top 6 and top 5 player at the last World Othello Championship. So I think I've known him for a few years right now, and I think what impressed me the most is how fast he's kind of moved up the ranks in terms of his Othello playing level. And definitely those who have joined the World Othello Championship 2016 and 2019, both actually being in Japan, would have known that he's achieved quite phenomenal results coming on as a relatively new player compared to people who have played more than 20 years. So I think today is going to be a special match, and of course we're going to play a 30 minutes XOT random opening game. So in terms of color, we'll keep it random. So yeah, I think I'll be playing black, and Taiwan Chan will be playing white, basically. So maybe before we begin, I'll just quickly explain. So exhibition game again, the mode is the same. So both players will think on their own. You can think quietly or think aloud, and before you make each move, you basically just try to articulate and explain your thought process before proceeding. So I'll be speaking in English, and Mr. Chang Chun-Yi will be conversing in Mandarin Chinese. So before we begin, maybe I'll invite him to say a few words. Junyi， 你在开始之前，你想要先说几句话吗？跟大家说几句话。
好，我讲一下好了。
好，
要感谢 Alex 邀请我参加这个比赛哈。那我也是第一次参加这种网络的比赛啊，有一点紧张。那希望等一下不要因为这样子就下得不好啊。然后希望可以至少可以再多撑一下，希望 Alex 手下留情，谢谢。
好，谢谢，谢谢。So yeah, without further ado, we'll start our game.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm playing black, so I'll go first. So given that this is a random opening, I think it's always wise to kind of spend an initial 1 or 2 minutes just to look at the situation, given that the opening is always unfamiliar to both players, and you don't want to kind of give away an early advantage to your opponent. So almost looking at how the black discs are situated, roughly to the top right of the board, almost immediately I'll probably look at... So the last move seems to be white playing to f6, flipping maybe 2 discs in e5 and f5 perhaps. I'm not too sure, I'm just guessing over here, but just thinking about regrouping, playing group small inside, that's the basic principle that doesn't change in Othello. So I think almost immediately I'll start to look at d3 just to regroup the disc. Of course, g3 is a disc that kind of stands alone, but at this point in time I don't really see any issue. So if you were to think about flipping one disc right in the center, you probably might think about b4 and b5 as well, but b4 and b5 kind of makes the shape a little bit more dispersive. Not too sure if that's actually better than d3 at this point, but d3 does seems to make the whole shape a little bit more compact. Another option is to kind of extend the shape down in terms of the same direction where white has just played. Maybe I'll consider e6. So I think just to be a bit on the more conservative side, I'll go with d3 being more compact.
Now我比较是想下有几个选择，可能 C3啊、C4、C3、C4、C5应该看起来都可以，但是因为这个随机开局的话，要一开始是最困难，所以我来考虑看看，如果是下这边 C4的话，会让对方有 可以下。如果是 C4 F3可能不太好。那 C5应该是个不错的选择，或者是 C3 C4 C2。想想看，我想下个 C3好了。C3的话，但 C3 C4也不太好。哇，一开始就觉得好难下。哦，如果 C4 对方如果下 F3的话，我下1 应该是个不错的选择。好，那我下 C4好了，看看。
Okay. So White's played to C4. So earlier he was mentioning that C4 kind of invites F3 as a response. That does seem like a very attractive response at this point in time, but he's finding kind of a consolation that he has a E1 move to kind of control the mini diagonal between D4 and F3. So that's the point that he's kind of comfortable with in terms of giving up F3. So that is interesting. Another kind of option for me to counteract that control or just jumping into this free move is to consider maybe E6 perhaps. E6 kind of controls that mini diagonal. So given that how he's played C4, I have a temporary control on the third row. If I were to play E6, I can still maintain a control of the mini diagonal between D5 this over here and the E4 this over here, and then kind of make him play one more move across, maybe E6, C5, D6, and then he probably jumps in to C3, which kind of becomes an access that he can access right to F3. So that's a little bit more concerning if I were to consider that. So another way to kind of prevent him from locking in the mini diagonal that I mentioned earlier, D4 and E3, would be to kind of jump onto C5 first, C5 give away C3, and then jump into F3. And then even if he does E1, I'll still retain access because I've established the C5 disk. I'll retain access to F2 to centralize. So that's one thing to think about as well. Another option that I'm thinking about is to just completely ignore the situation below and maybe play C2 or D1, which does seem a little bit far-fetched based on this shape. If I were to play D1 and he regroups down to E6 as a whole, I may be then forced to break out to the shape below first, so that may not be that advisable. So I think I'll go for C5. C5 does look a little bit more safer. Even if he takes E6 in response, I can take C3, and he jumps to C2, I can still grab D1. Yeah, so I'll go with C5.
F3的话， 有几个选择哦。第一个 C3或者是E5也是不错。哦，E5可以防止对方下 F3，但是我E5下了之后，C3就被下走了。E5 C3 C2的话，这样子是可以。那如果先下 C3的话，C3 F3，我再下 C2，这样子不错。所以现在如果是 C3跟E5两个选的话，我可能偏向会下 C3吧，C3好一点，让白纸比较集中一点吧。再想一下，C3 F3 B2 E5，好，那我下 C3好。
Okay, so White has played c3, cutting back. So he cited that's a little bit more conservative compared to e6, to kind of nestle the disc and to consider the future playouts. So based on my move to c5 and c3, that was with an anticipation to jump into f3. So I would probably just take a quick look at c3 disc that is established access to regroup to f3. So yeah, I probably wouldn't be able to prevent it nicely, because prevent it would mean flipping 2 discs or 3 discs in 2 different directions or more. So prevention is out. Poisoning it doesn't seem too likely, even if I were to play e6 at this point. So I think taking the move does seem like the most rationale move right now, to just nestle into the center. And given that I've established c5, I'll be comfortable even if he plays e1 per se. So just anticipating f3, maybe c2, and then followed by d1 sequence, or f3, c2, and I can still play e6 and still nestle into the center. Yeah, I'll go with f3.
C2 是个不错的选择，不过如果 C2 对方下 D1，我再来可能就不会很好下。不过 C2 的话，我其实随时要下都可以下，所以我是觉得 C2 可以先留着，之后再下也没关系。不下 C2 的话，E1这个不错的选择，E1或者是E6，E6也不错。我下E6的话，等一下还可以下 C2。如果是 C2，因为E6对黑子来讲应该也是一个不错的地方，所以E6应该会比较好。好，那我下E6。
Okay, so White's played e6, comparing e6 against c2. He does find that c2 is still accessible for him, so he might as well play e6 first. That's quite a fair assessment. Right now, I do have a quick selection over here in terms of how he's established this shape across, with more like a 2 disc thick ladder shape over here. So I think almost immediately I'll consider jumping into d6 as a centralizing move. D6, even if I open up g5 for him, I can jump into f2 perhaps. D6, g5, f2. Maybe he can nestle back to c2. So it becomes a very exchange-based sequence. Another option for me is to just completely ignore the bottom, considering that white is closing it out. Maybe I move on to the edge by playing c1, potentially, or d1 perhaps. Another option would be b4. I think it all seems a little playable, perhaps. So regrouping and centralizing, maybe b4 is possible. b4 does open up a flank that might potentially poison the moves to the top, so that's the main concern there. So if I were to play c1, maybe opponent will consider f2 perhaps as a backdoor move. If c1, c2, I can still play to b3, gain back access to d1 perhaps just to regroup to the top. Then the whole game becomes a very h-play based game. If I were to choose d6, it will become a very centralized base game. So I think that's pretty much the difference that I see right now. So I think playing a H-based game is usually more risky. So it's a high risk, high return situation. If you play more towards a centralized one, it will probably still be fair, or more fairly even in terms of both players' situation. So I think I'll just jump and retain into the center with d6 right now, just to keep the game a bit more even.
现在黑子很集中哦，那看起来好像也没有什么地方好，就可能刚刚的 C2 好一点，其他的话好像没有什么地方是比较好的。如果下 G5 G5， 对方下 F2， 这样也不好。大概只剩下 C2 了吧。好，那我下 G5。
Okay, so white has played c2, taking his centralizing card. So you can see black is basically trying to centralize from the bottom left to the top right, while white is trying to do the reverse, centralizing from the top left to the bottom right. So usually that's what happens when both players are fairly experienced. You have fairly established thought process. So typically the minor differences will then come in when you hit towards the mid game edge play in terms of the tempo. I think right now I have a slight advantage in terms of the bottom left shape, because regardless of how white plays out, I always have a easy move. So if white plays to b5, I can easily play c6. If white plays d7, I can easily play c6 as well. So the bottom left shape does look a little bit more favorable for me. The next move probably white might consider as g5. Preventing it will probably mean playing d1. D1 probably invites f1, which is the usual edge play shape. D1 f1, maybe feed off the edge. Maybe if I sandwich the edge, he'll cut into the center with h3. If I feed the edge to e1, he probably takes c1, and then I'll be forced to jump out. So either way, a bit of a risk. So usually when you kind of approach the edge a little early, so this is always going to be a bit of a two-sided affair. Black white, black white, black perhaps, white. So yeah, I think that would probably work out if I were to consider D1, F1, E1, C1 sequence, then follow up with the cover on H4, allowing white both options either to G5 or F2, and then open up to the bottom towards E7 perhaps. Okay, I'll go on to just take the simple approach with D1.
这个盘面看起来大概也只有 F1 可以下了吧，其他地方，其他都感觉没有什么好地方可以下。F1、E1、C1，好像也只能这样子。白纸感觉情况没有很好啊。是 V5的话，V5可能可以考虑看看。F1 可能之后再下也没关系。V5、V6，或者是 V5。但是 V5、V6就会不好下。V5、C6、D7，好像可以试着下下看，让盘面乱一点，好像不错。F1跟 V5的话，好，下 V5看看好。
Okay, so the expected move from my end was probably F1, allowing me to give the edge. I think he's kind of assessed that and felt that maybe that sequence would be too predictable, so he decided to play B5, make the situation a little bit more complicated, inviting C6. So earlier I mentioned that the shape on the bottom left is good for me because if he does break into B5, I can get C6, a fairly easy, two disc flip in one direction and nestled into the center of the disc. And I think he's probably going to follow up with E7, just a one disc diagonal chip off, continuing trying to maintain a center shape. So something to think about is how should I follow up thereafter. Black, white, maybe black jump into D7 following E7. If he takes the edge, I can play the poison. If he wipes the B6, I can still nestle in between to C7. Okay, so I think C6 is a fairly safe option, so we'll go with that.
那就照我刚刚想的，如果是 V5 在 E5，讲说 V5、C6、D7的话，E7对方弱下 E7，这样子我就下不到 E7了。不过 D7应该也是一个不错的地方。 那如果现在下 F1 的话，黑子下 B6，我就会很不好下，所以可能就只是照刚刚的想法，我下 D7，应该是比较好的。
Okay, so white has played d7, just playing the tail end, a diagonal chip cut tail end of this entire D column of discs, which is usually kind of a hidden tail theory. In this case, white is probably going to progress with either c7 or e7, either one of those moves. I think playing e7 immediately removes the e5 disc that provides access to c7. So I think it achieves two objectives at the same time, prevents e7, blocks out c7. The only concern over here is what if I played e7, maybe white follow us up with f8 over here, and still has one more tempo over here to f7 in the future. Maybe if I ignore it, I'll play it out here, and white takes that, jump in, white jumps into g6 perhaps. Then I'll be forced to break out. Probably not a shape that I would want to be in, perhaps. So other options on the left does seem a bit too loud and unnecessary to break out to. So I think probably e7 still seems like the safer choice. Let's go with e7.
黑子下1-7的话，我c7就下不到了哦。那这样子的话，黑子还有一步 h4 的好棋。那这样我看起来还是要下 F1 的，剩下 F1，其他应该没什么地方可以下了，还是 F8，但是 F8的话，左边就会整个都变成白棋，会整个都下不到，会很麻烦。就 F8太危险了，应该是下 F1 会比较好，应该是下 F1 吧。好，那下 F1 好了。
Okay, so white has played f1. Typically, when you approach an f1 kind of one square gap against your own edge move, the typical sequence is to just feed off the edge, especially if it's poison. But right now, it's not poison with any of the white discs along this mini diagonal between d2 to f4. So black-white would actually be a very clean move for white to follow, but I can then kind of jump to h4, giving white two options in f2 or g5, and whichever one he takes, I'll probably be able to take the other, perhaps, or at least work around it. Another option is to play a move like maybe f2, but f2 it's typically only played if you have access to c1 itself. But right now I wouldn't have access to c1. If playing f2 allows white to cut into the center with h3, establish that key disc at e3 to give him both access to either g5 or c1, then it would render that kind of approach meaningless. So I think the safer approach would be to consider e1 almost immediately, feed off the left edge, continue to kind of try to pull white to the right side. So I'll go with e1.
那这一步的话，我大概也只剩下希望可以下了。我下希望等一下还有 G5可以下。 那如果其他的地方的话，我如果不下C1的话，黑子下G1，我之后大概就没棋可以下了，连C1都下不到。那现在大概也没得选择了吧，就只能下C1。
Okay, so white has played c1. If white doesn't play c1 and plays elsewhere, I'll take g1, and white essentially loses 2 tempos. That's too much to lose. So yeah, given that situation, I think it's almost like a situation where he has no choice but to take it. So again, earlier I mentioned after c1, h4 is kind of the move to go to, because you create either f2 or g5 situation whereby you give your opponent 2 options, which both options you can work around. If he plays to f2, I can work around, maybe play c7. If he plays g5, I can play f2 itself. So I think h4 is probably the move to go to right now.
那现在就跟刚刚讲的一样哦，我下C1之后，G5就可以下了，但是 G5对方黑子下 F2，也只能这样，因为G5是为了把 F4这个变成白色，这样我就能下到C7这个地方，所以。而且如果不下 G5，我也不知道该下哪边了。F2嘛，F2的话，我觉得不太好，吃太多了。F2的话，或许可以等到整个 F 牌都被吃成黑色的话，再下会更好一点。但是我如果说下 G5 F2就被下走，我还有 G1可以下，那应该 G5是会比较好的选择。至于刚刚的 F8，现在如果要下 F8的话，应该不是很好，因为现在整个黑子都已经集中在右半边了。如果说下 F8的话，我可能会逼迫被下到右半边，这样对于之后的形势看起来不太理想。还是下 G5好了。
Okay, so opponent has played g5, cutting into the center. I think that's a fair move to take compared to f2. f2 and f8 probably makes the whole game too lopsided for white to control. So earlier I mentioned that if white plays g5, I have a nice crisscross move back to f2. So right now when I'm just looking at f2 again, one of the concern is f2 g1, and then basically white still establishes a very nice control on the mini diagonal between c1 and g5. That will probably be a bit of a concern as I try to move to the lower right and just try to pull white in. And at the same time, g5 establishes f4 that creates access to c7. So that's probably something that I also want to think about at this point in time. So another move to kind of think about is to try to remove the f4 disk. So removing the f4 disk, I don't have any moves along the mini diagonal between c1 and g5, so there's no way for me to play h6 to try to achieve that. So the only move that I have is f7 to remove the f4 disk that provides access to c7. So the cost to playing this move is to create an entire a solid column in the F column that allows white to play a very nice quiet move to F2, and then thereafter I then kind of play around this G5 disk to regroup to the right perhaps. That's one option to take. Yeah, I think it's probably worth the risk because it prevents one nice move to c7 for white in exchange for one nice move to f2. At the same time, I don't give up too much of a h access. I might be wrong, but usually a move like f2 could be quite a double-edged sword in a sense that either it's very good and I give up the unbalanced edge and I attack it thereafter, or I completely lose control of the mini diagonal access of an edge play move. I think black is probably slightly ahead at this point, so I probably want to just play it a bit safe in terms of regrouping for the shape. So I'll go for f7 compared to f2.
F7当然是为了防止我下C7嘛。那我现在如果想下C7的话，我大概要下1-8，把1-5这个子弹变成白色才有办法下。但是下1-8的话，黑子下C8的话，我这个C7的位置就会变得不好了。所以我现在可能就是放弃刚刚C7的想法。而且现在因为 F 牌都变成黑的话，我 F2的话就会变成一个好棋，所以反而现在可能 F2会比1-8来得好一点。而且我如果不下 F2的话，黑子也可以下。如果是 F2，黑子下C8，我还可以下 F3。如果 D7这个白子被吃掉的话，我 F3就是一个不错的地方。那如果说 F2、H5，那我可能就比较不好下。可是，我可能还是要下 F2吧。这样再看看黑子等一下要下什么，我再来决定之后的战术好了。好，那先下 F2。
Okay, so white has played f2, so definitely taking up the quiet move that has opened up. So one way to think about mid games is to think of it passively, especially when you think you're slightly in the lead. For me, I think I'm slightly in the lead, so I would think of what if right now it's white's turn. Where would white want to play? White would probably want to play to e8, split out the disc, create one more c7 move for himself, perhaps, or jump over here to g6. So right now h3 is poisoned. It's probably more favorable for me to play around this g5 disc, considering the 3 moves that interacts with g5 over here to continue the regroup. And if white were to cut out to e8, I still have f8 to rely on, e8, f8, and then c7. You can probably approach the unbalanced h to the bottom from right to left. Another option is to completely ignore it, play around d7 disc. If I were to play d8 move, this unpoisons the h3 disc. Probably not that favorable. Any of the moves on the left doesn't seem to make sense at this point in time, especially when I have one white disc to work with on the right hand side. So definitely among these 3, I'll probably choose one of them. So let's see. So if I were to play h5, that kind of invites multiple tempo hits on g6 and then followed by h6 in the future for white, perhaps. If I were to play g6 gives white an opportunity to play h6, control the edge, but I think that seems fine for my end. If I were to play g6, probably e8, g6, e8, f8, c2, c7. So black, white, I'll probably be forced to take this on the edge. He'll probably give out the unbalanced edge to me and then attack the unbalanced edge. So probably not that favorable in terms of the shape that I foresee. It does seem a bit difficult at this point. Another option is to play out to c8, give out h3, h3 followed by probably h5 or h6 or even g6. Then he'll probably use the established g3 this attack to c7. So let me just visualize this sequence in my mind a little bit. Black, if I were to choose h6 right now and I create a 1 square gap, probably no merit in that. I'll probably result in a situation whereby I actually lose moves. Black, white, if I were to just jump into the diagonal cut, black, white, black, white, black. Probably still advantage for me. So I think I'll go along with g6, given how it's more poisoning towards the right edge. I think that opens up more opportunities for me. If I were to go for h5, probably not that favorable. h6 seems to be a bit strangely risky. So let's go with g6.
现在有2个想法，一个是 H3 或者是1-8，但是如果下1-8的话，1-8是为了可以下到7-7，但是下1-8对方下7-8的话，我之后就会不是很好走了。H3的话，它有个好处可以是防止对方下7-8，而且对方 H5 黑子也是下不到的。看起来 H3 会比1-8来得好一点。那就先下 H3， 如果 H3 黑子如果下 H2 的话，我再来下1-8，这样或许会比较好。那就先下 H3 好了。
Okay, so white has played h3, preventing c8, and right now I still control this mini diagonal. Probably not too advisable to play on the tail end on c7. If I were to play d8, gives up an easy c7. Probably no merit to it. One interesting thing is to notice that the top shape is a white wall for me, so I can still play h2 probably with ease, even though it's a c square, establish an attackable unbalanced edge, but at the same time I prevent c7 from happening momentarily. And I think even with white's e8, I can still pull out with f8. F8 itself is a loud move for white. So black, white, black, or black, white, either one works for me, I think, both in terms of tempo. So I'll go ahead with playing the h2.
H2 的话，就是防止我下c7。那我现在下1-8，对方的c8就不是很好了。只是说，我现在如果先下了1-8，待会下 H5 的时候，我就会多吃了G6跟 F7 2个字，所以我认为应该是先下 H5，先攻击 H1 的角，逼对方下 H6，我再来下1-8可能会好一点。 那其他地方的话，嗯，如果下 H6的话，我是觉得不是很好的选择，因为 G5 像 G4、G5、G6三个都变成白纸的话，我就下不到 H5。那对方下 G2就是一个很好的地方，所以我可能还是先下 H5 逼对方下 H6吧。如果 H5 对方下 G2，我就 H1 吃掉，这样我还是可以吃到7-7，所以应该是没什么问题。对 H5 应该可以。
Okay, so white has played h5, essentially kind of a forced move for me, establishing the same tempo in terms of just keeping the h strong and just defending the h. I see no reason to kind of ignore this, so I'll just take h6.
那我现在大概就剩下1-8了，现在已经没有办法再去争下到 C7这个地方。如果想下 C7，我必须要下 G2，但是 G2太危险，整个右边上面整个都送给黑子，所以我是觉得 G2不行，所以还是只能下1-8。那其他大概也没什么地方好下了。下 F8的话是太多了，输掉了，还是只剩下1-8了。
Okay, so white has played e8. Almost immediately, I'll probably think about jumping to f8, but e8, f8, he'll probably play g8, and he still has one more tempo to g7 to go for a poison attackable unbalanced edge. So let's take a look and see whether that flow works out. Black, white, black. Black, white, and then I'll probably still have to think of one move to play to. Another option is to just play c8 immediately. So one strength about c8 to be played at this point in time is because if he were to give up the edge, black, if he doesn't give up the edge and plays this move, I can still jump into f8. There is probably a chance of being land out if I were to take up the solid edge too early. Black, white, black, feed off, perhaps. Black, white, black, white. So I think the safer approach to establish the bottom edge is in fact not to form a solid edge too quickly. Black, white, black. Okay, I should probably not want to form the solid edge. Let's see. C8. C8, if he feeds off, I jump in, he'll feed off to try to get a Landau maneuver. Would the Landau maneuver work? Black, white, black, white. Black, white, black, white, black, white. So I definitely have enough tempo probably at this point in time. Black, white, black, white, black, white, black. Black, white, black, white, black, white, black. Over here, create success. White, black. So I think giving away the Landau maneuver seems to be a bit more detrimental, but probably a safer approach. So let's go with c8.
那现在的想法就是要想办法去攻击右边哦，因为我大概左边大概都下不到了。那唯一的想法就是要攻击右边右下角，让对方知道 H8，我就可以抢 H1。只是说现在右边上面这边 感觉对白子也是不太好下。那如果下 D8，黑子 F8，哦，我下 G8 H8 G7的话，我这边 H7应该就是一个不错，大概也只能这样了吧。而且我如果不下 D8，黑子就会下了，所以 D8是一定要下的。D8，然后再去准备攻击右上。好，大概就是先下 D8吧。
Okay, so white has played d8. The natural response is to just take f8. Probably invite the Landau. Black, white, black, white. Slightly risky, but black, white, but more predictable. Black, white, white, black, perhaps white, black. So giving up the Landau does seem to be probably not the best sequence, I guess, but safer in terms of a closeout. So let's go with that. F8.
不太好下哎。G8，如果照刚刚讲的 G8 H8 G7 G2 H7，哇，对方还有一个 C7，这样子的话就不是很好下。那如果现在在考虑说 H7 或许是一个可以想的地方，因为像 H7的话，黑子就下不到 G2。H7 H8，我再下 G2。哇，这样看起来有点危险，但是是可以逼黑子往左边下，是一个可以试试看。但是这样我觉得有点冒险呢，还是 G7。我觉得要下 G7 倒不如下 G8会比较好。那好，拼拼看好了，下 H7看看。
Okay, so surprisingly, white has played h7. So I think h7 gives up the corner. It's kind of a forced move for me as well, so I'll probably have to take it. I think his main objective is to try to prevent me from getting in. So he wants to try to get multiple tempo, maybe try to attack the tempo in a different way, g8 followed by g7. So I'll just take the corner anyway.
好像不太好。现在下 G2 C7 G7 V3，这样我就下不到 G8了。哇，看样子刚才的 H7不是很好。 那现在如果下 G8，好像也不好。哇哦！大概没地方下了吧？好，那就 G2好了。
Okay, so White has played G2. So probably the only risk here is for him to play G8 consequently and take G7 for multiple tempo. So one way to kind of prevent that is to just simply establish a disk along the G column. So that can be done mainly with B3, creating G3, and I don't think G3 is removable. So G3, I mean B3, even if he does respond out to B4, C7 can still be quiet move, and I still gain the F3 disk that gives me the corner to H1. So I'll go ahead with B3.
那现在的话，我如果下 V4，这样把 C3、C4两个都吃掉的话，对方的 C7就变成好棋了。那 G8又下不到了，所以现在可能剩下 A4吧。A4我等一下还有 V4可以下，那也只剩下这个地方了。
Okay, opponent has played A4, which is the logical move to play at this point. I'm thinking just to take H1, G1, wrap up to B1. Probably no risk there, perhaps. So I'll go ahead with that sequence.
再来我不下 G1，黑子就下了。或许还是可以先下 G8、G8、G1、G7、G1。还是只是这样 G1。
Okay, so White has played G1 for fear of loss of tempo. So I think the natural sequence to go for is to just go for B1, just sweep up, re-establish. It's important to re-establish the access down along the G column. So let's do that.
那现在如果下 V4的话，黑子下 V2。G8或 G7好像也不是很好，那大概只能先下 B2了吧。
Okay, so White has played B2 just to make the situation a bit more complex. So I think I'll just go ahead with the corner, keeping it safe.
那白子的好处就是有偶数啊，那 不过现在如果真的要这样子下，大概像 B4了吧？
So white's main saving grace right now is parity. So basically playing b4 just to try to gain parity in terms of leaving this even shape out. So black, white, black follow up, then white is somewhat poisoned. So I think that's a bit of a concern in terms of parity. So usually black, even if you're in the lead, there's a slight concern in terms of parity. So I'll just sweep from left to right and see how it goes.
那现在大概 B7不可能吧？就只剩下 A3。
Okay, so if I were to play to A5, one concern is B6. That would poison pretty much the move over here. I'll probably prefer to do an interior sweep, perhaps. Yeah, let's go with an interior sweep of B6 instead.
哇，快没时间了。剩下 A577的话，B7对方下 A5就没地方考下，那先下 A5 好。
Okay, so black has played A5. If I were to just play to A6, he'll probably just jump in for natural parity. So I think the natural flow would give him parity, but in terms of the disk, I should still be able to capture a sufficient number of disks due to the F column being mine as a solid one. So I'll go with A6.
那我大概哇没时间，剩77。
Okay, so over here, I'll pretty much just give out the unbalanced edge. So when white attacks it, I'll be able to sweep entire columns and rows, and when he jumps in, I'll still be able to kind of do a diagonal sweep down to B7. So yeah, let's go with this.
哦，我让我先下去吧。
Okay, so I'll just sweep this row, and then the last move. Okay, good game.
谢谢。
好，谢谢。我觉得可能这个开局可能对黑子比较有利，会比较容易下。对，刚才白棋应该很难下。Yeah. So one of the main things about random openings is that luck could be in a factor whereby you're handed a difficult opening. So you can't really select your opening. So I think I probably got a slightly better opening to play with right from the get-go, easier to centralize. So I think Mr. Chang had a more harder time just trying to establish the center as a result of that opening. So still, thank you very much for joining me in this exhibition game. So 非常感谢，非常感谢你。对对。So I'll see you guys in the next episode for the next exhibition game. Thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one.